Welcome to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Investment Management Industry. I am so pleased to be here with you today and have the opportunity to have this conversation. I think I can speak for the three of us that we are committed to having a dynamic, color brave, and courageous discussion. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today, Carlotta King and Rob Burks. Carlotta King is General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Diamond Capital Management, which is an independent investment management firm with an intrinsic value investment philosophy. And we're also welcoming Rob Burks, who is the Chief Compliance Officer of Brown Capital Management, which is the country's second oldest African American investment advisor. Welcome to the audience. We welcome and invite you to use the comment section for questions, and even if you just want to share your perspective and experience. Before we get started with our conversation today, I would like to take care of one housekeeping item. And the continuing education code at this point is one word, and it's DEI. Again, DEI. Okay, let's get started. Hi, Carlotta. Hello, Rob. Good to see you both.
Hello.
Hello. Where I'd like to start today is let's talk about and level set. Where do you see the most progress being made in the investment management industry? And then where do you think it's lagging with respect to diversity and inclusion? Carlotta, let's start with you.
Thank you, Hope. So I think where I do see some progress is that the investment management industry seems to be more willing to have conversations like this one, which I think is an important first step. I think, up until maybe a year ago, people had been avoiding having these conversations because they were uncomfortable or because they were comfortable with the status quo. And I think people now have some recognition that, uncomfortable or not, these conversations are necessary and that the status quo is no longer acceptable. So, I think there are numerous instances, but for example, with the recent NASDAQ proposed rules around, disclosure of board diversity and mandating that at least two directors on any board be diverse. However you feel about the rule, my email inbox blew up. Like there was clearly a lot of dialogue that it prompted around our boards, around diversity, around why our boards are not diverse, and got people thinking proactively about what they might need to do. I think where our industry is lagging is in coming up with kind of clear, long-term, firm commitments that they can be held accountable for around improving diversity in their firms, in their communities, and in the industry. I think everyone's made kind of broad-based statements around being supportive of diversity, or maybe made a couple of financial commitments or financial donations. But I think having kind of long-term goals where you're committing to, improving diversity in your own workforce, supporting efforts in your community to expand diversity, et cetera, I think we're still in our infancy on those things.
Thank you for that. What say you, Rob?
Yeah, sure. I would echo the things that Carlotta just talked about and just mentioned. I would also point out that the fact that we're having this conversation on this stage at this conference is evidence of progress. And kudos to Karen Barr and the IAA for leading the charge in terms of having conversations and doing the work to help all of the members of the IAA to see the importance. I would add that in the area that we're lagging would be in transparency. And I was prepared to make a very solid and compelling case for more of it. However, the panel inside the Beltway stole my thunder. So I will just say that the work of the House of Representatives, the Committee on Financial Services led by the Honorable Maxine Waters and the Honorable Joyce Beatty, their work in pushing forward transparency started with banks in last year, and I'm encouraged to hear that it's going to expand to other subsets of the industry. I'm also encouraged that the SEC will hear in an open to public meeting later this month from its diversity and inclusion subcommittee on recommendations that it might have on this topic. So I'll be tuning in to hear more of that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd love to hear and understand from both of you, what do you say to people who see a company's efforts regarding diversity, equity, inclusion as beneficial, but not necessarily essential to a company's success? What would be your response to that? Carlotta?
One, I would say that is an outdated view. I think what has been clearly shown is that having diverse perspectives is fundamental to good decision making. And I think creating an inclusive work environment means creating a culture where everyone feels welcomed, accepted, and valued. And so I think actually diversity is very essential to a company's success. And you see it both in the returns you'll achieve because, you have people willing to share different perspectives, disagree, and kind of, work through issues from lots of different perspectives, but also in the way your employees are happy to be at their job, happy to be contributing to the success of your business and expressing that with kind of their longevity at the firm. So I understand why some people might view DEI is kind of a trend or a side issue that's separate from the business, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear through lots of studies and otherwise that it is kind of now essential to the success going forward of a business.
Yeah, so I certainly echo all of those sentiments. Certainly, for starters, we're hearing on the panels earlier today, and that the regulatory entities are considering what authority they have in this space and how can they be used, their authority to push forward diversity, equity, inclusion. In addition, investors are showing increased expectation for the firms that they hire to embrace diversity, equity, inclusion. And then maybe even more compelling, the economic power wielded by people of color is increasing year by year. African Americans have $1.3 trillion in economic buying power. Eventually, there will be recognition that we should only do business with those who embrace and support diversity, equity, inclusion. And when that happens, firms they'll either be on the right side and enjoy in the fruit of that labor, or they'll be left behind. And so I think, what is it that the firm thinks, which side of the coin do they want to be on? Which side of the fence would they like to be on at this point?
So I thank you both for that. I look forward to the day when that question is just removed from these discussions altogether, and we're no longer, making the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're getting there. So I appreciate that. Rob, a question for you. As the business world moves forward, do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion are going to be more important as far as whether or not a company can remain successful? And then if you could also talk to us a little bit about, how that path to success looks over the coming years.
Very, very good question. I think it's like we just stated. I think it's certainly going to be important for companies to maintain their success by embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the pathway to that success is by hiring more people of color into the financial services industry, particularly asset management, and then putting them in the positions that allow them to experience the wealth generation that these career paths can have. The more successful individuals, the more successful people of color in these roles, the more respect that we all garner, and ultimately having more success by people helping to close that generational wealth gap, that economic wealth gap that exists in our country.
Thank you for that. I know that when we were preparing for this conversation, you shared a good example of how the investment management industry can take some of the examples that other industries have used to expose young people to the industry. Can you share that with us?
Yes. So I saw a picture as we were preparing of a number of young elementary school kids in hard hats and fluorescent life vests. And they were obviously getting a lesson in either construction or engineering. And I think it's important for the asset management, the financial services, not necessarily just asset management, but financial services industry as a whole, to start as young as possible to light the path toward a career in financial services. So now I understand that many companies to hire and recruit, they don't necessarily have the entry level positions because of the level of sophistication and licensing that's needed to do this work. There may not be a whole lot of entry level jobs. I get that and understand that. The short term says, okay, well, if I can't hire anyone right away for my recruiting efforts, then maybe it's not necessary for me to recruit. But I would suggest that you consider it an investment, a long-term approach to diversity and inclusion in our industry by reaching back as early as kindergarten to getting, maybe your firm is more apt to reach out and be mentors toward a classroom of students and expose them to career paths in financial services. Reach back as early as possible to light that path, and so that we all have a greater runway to become successful in this industry.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a great takeaway that I hope the audience appreciates. So Carlotta, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about a company's culture and a company's attitude. There may be some in the audience that are perhaps a little discouraged with the progress that their particular organization may or may not be making with respect to diversity and inclusion. So we know that it's hard to kind of shift a company's culture and attitude overnight, but what would you say to those that may be a little discouraged, a little frustrated at the progress?
I would say definitely don't lose heart, and also don't give up on your individual commitment, because I think there are things that we can all do at whatever level we are at our firm to make a difference, as Rob was alluding to. There are many ways to reach back and pay it forward as an individual, even outside of whatever your companies are doing. But also, I would emphasize what I was saying at the beginning. This is a long-term commitment. At any given organization, for example, there's only so much year-over-year turnover. So when the numbers of diverse employees at your firm don't look materially better in a year from now, well, they're only going to look so much better after a year because there's only so much turnover. There are only so many new people brought on. But, focus on the long term. Focus on, is your firm making a commitment long term? And if they're not currently, are there avenues that you can get a dialogue going about making those commitments? Or things that Rob was alluding to about partnerships. To put my own business out there on the street, there were a lot of programs that I was in from middle school onward that were geared towards directing all sorts of minorities towards the financial services industry. Those gave me access in a way that I would never have had being a girl from, Ohio. And it took a lot of companies to partner with those organizations to make those opportunities available. And so even if you could encourage your firm to explore those kinds of partnerships, those opportunities, all of those things long-term make a huge difference, even if you don't see them in your firm's numbers tomorrow.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Rob?
No, I mean, we didn't rehearse this part, but she echoed pretty much exactly what I was saying about reaching back. I would say in terms of preparing and lighting the path, exposing individuals to career paths in our industry, I think it's important for mentorships to be a part of that conversation, that we all should be both a mentee and a mentor. And what I mean by that is, as professionals, we should be developing our own career paths and educating ourselves, sharpening our toolkits, sharpening our tools on a regular basis. And that might require seeking a mentor, someone who has blazed the trail already and can help you to navigate some of what you're doing in your own professional life. So at the same time you have a hand that you're reaching forward, you need to have one that you're reaching back. Whether it be to the kindergartners that I just referred to, or if it's a high school internship program or even a college internship program, we need to bridge the gap, having one hand forward, one hand back, helping pull each other along so that we further grow and develop in this industry.
Thanks for that. We do have some questions from those that are listening today, so keep them coming. The first question is, does people of color include Latinos, Asians, and Arabs, etc.?
In my world,
absolutely.
100% and absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why we're speaking diversity broadly, because like I said, having diverse perspectives is important. And I think that means people of every ethnicity. I think that means people of every gender. I think that means people of every age. I think diversity is exactly what it sounds like. And I think if you're going to be inclusive, inclusivity implies everyone. And so, yes, I think in all of these conversations, it's important to think about all of those different demographic groups and think about your firm's composition with respect to all of them as you're making your commitments.
Okay, wholeheartedly agree. Nothing to add there.
Okay, same. I agree. A second question is, someone is expressing that they're concerned that the approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts may be a fad. I think Carlotta, you might have mentioned that earlier, and that the amount of attention and calls to action this topic generates may fade over time. What do you believe we can do to ensure that this never happens again within the investment management industry? Rob, it looks like you're thinking, so I'm going to shift to Carlotta first and give you a moment.
I was going to say, I always have a thought, Hope. So, so I think that there's definitely a concern from a lot of people. I think I'm less concerned that it's a fad for a couple of reasons. One, DEI is a subset of ESG. So, when you think about environmental social governance, social right now in the US means DEI. I mean, in Europe and other places, it encapsulates lots of different things. But from a US domestic perspective, I think it really means DEI. And I'm astounded by kind of the exponential growth in questions I get on a daily basis from investors, focusing on ESG generally, but specifically on DEI. I think there are calls from investors to give their money to people who are going to be committed to this cause. And I think whether people are hesitant or not, business is always going to follow the money. And therefore, the investors kind of insistent on this as an important topic of focus on a continuous basis. It's going to help make sure it is not a fad. But as I said, I think there's always an element of personal responsibility and accountability on this. As long as we individually take on the mandate for ourselves for this not to be a fad, it won't be.
Yeah, I would add to that. Spot on, Carlotta. I would add to that it just can't be a fad. I mean, it's 2021, and when you think about the systemic racism that we've all faced at some point in trying to get into this industry in particular, it just can't be a fad. You think of the images that you saw last summer as a result of police brutality. Think of the names Eric Gardner and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. I mean, it can't be a fad. We have to check our moral compass, all of us, and decide that we're not going to let it be a fad, right? We're not going to believe that it's going to be a fad. And I think if we think in that vein and we start to speak as though it's not going to be a fad, it actually won't be.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. We've got the audience is engaged, so I am thankful for that. So we've got another question here. One challenge that an audience member has noticed is that firms of all sizes at firms of all sizes, that when diversity seems to be a check the box exercise, either to attract certain clients or to attract for company image purposes, what have you observed as successful approaches to DEI that go beyond just that kind of let's do this to get the client or have the company image be positive because of it? And let's see, Carlotta. Okay.
So I think you can sense where it's a check the box exercise, meaning firms that are committed truly to DEI have a culture that is supportive of all different people and all different views. And where someone is checking the box, bringing on, for example, people of color, but without a real commitment, the culture isn't going to be supportive, and you're going to see it in their turnover. Those people are not going to stay. They may be here tomorrow, but they're not going to be here next year. Where you see a true cultural commitment to diversity and support of that commitment, you see that people stay. And so I think at any, if you took a snapshot of a firm, yes, you might see something that wouldn't allude to the fact that it's a check the box exercise. But I think if you pay attention over time, you're definitely going to see it. And I think more and more we're seeing questionnaires in the industry, whether it's, my firm sends now a DI questionnaire to all its vendors, or every client sends us a questionnaire. I think those questions also tend to ask over time frame. How is your number compared to last year? How is it compared to 3 years ago? And so when you're required to answer those questions to get the business, it becomes even more obvious where you just done something today versus where you've been doing something for a while.
Mm-hmm. And to piggyback on a comment Carlotta made earlier, she talked about following the money. I think when two things make DEI successful is when first you've got genuine supportive leadership. The CEO herself is leading the charge to say, this is what we're going to do as a firm. We understand the business case for it. And I am personally going to be involved in the exchange of ideas and thoughts. And then follow the firm's money. Is it supporting training and training and development for people of color within its walls? If it's big enough or large enough for the resources to include an employee resource group, does the firm support it by giving it a budget for initiatives and programs to celebrate and help develop the people in those particular groups, affinity groups? So again, follow the money. It's top-down approach, and it's actually putting money to the programs and resources that will help it be successful.
Thank you. Another question we received from the audience is, first of all, they say thanks for the great discussion, so thank you. Are there best practices emerging on how to very respectfully collect DEI-related data to help measure a company's progress towards its goals? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if you're talking about internally at your own firm or externally from, a potential firm that you want to invest with. I'd say when it comes to internally at your own firm right now, I think, one, it still has to be optional for the most part. And I also think anonymity helps. People, when they know their, demographic information is going to be aggregated with the other employees of their firm, tend to be less concerned about disclosing it than if, they're going to be identifiable. And therefore, I think, for some people, I think that anonymity helps give them an extra layer of comfort to feel comfortable disclosing that information. I think over time, hopefully it will become commonplace enough where there won't be discomfort, but I do acknowledge that right now we're kind of in the in-between phase. I think when it comes to asking it of someone who you're going to give your money to, I think you have to make the request respectful, but beyond that, I think you ask what you want to ask. I mean, I think it's if they want your money, they're going to be transparent to the extent they can be. And I think if there's not a willingness to be transparent, as Rob was talking about earlier on in this presentation, that in and of itself often tells you a lot. But you're right. If you're talking about from an internal employee perspective, I think it's hard to mandate anything right now. I think it really is about kind of anonymity, aggregation, optionality at this point in time.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So
well said.
Go ahead. Oh, perfect.
I said, well said. That was well said. Yeah.
So Rob, we have another question from our audience. It's a great question. What are your thoughts on creating a culturally diverse workforce in a location with a generally culturally non-diverse demographic?
That's a good one. We have to throw out the traditional constructs about how to engage from a recruiting perspective, how to engage people of different demographics. So, and what I mean by that is we tend to feel more comfortable engaging those that are similar to me. In order to get to the level of conversation that you need to have with someone else, you've got to strip off all the preconceived ideas and notions that you thought you knew about that demographic and approach it with, I'm going to sound so cliche, but I'm going to say you have to approach it with love, honor, and respect. And once you've taken that approach, I think the individuals, the group that you're engaging will recognize that it's of a genuine nature, the nature that you are approaching them. It's not a check the box exercise. You do truly understand what motivates them in terms of being potential employees and things of that nature. And then that conversation becomes a lot easier for you to then understand what will motivate them to want to join your firm as an employee.
Thanks for that. Carlotta, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that was well said. And Rob has been following me, so I will let Rob drop that mic and we can move on.
Okay, excellent. So
one more thing. I just had one more thought on that. It may be scary to go into places where you've not gone before to have those conversations. And so think about where you can identify those individuals coming together. You've got professional societies, you've got alumni associations, you've got even some trade associations, and then you can make it fun and social. You've got social organizations that you might be able to tap into to learn and understand how do you approach a certain population.
Thanks for that. I just want to pause here for a moment. We only have about 5 more minutes left, and I'd like to provide the second code. And so the second continuing education code word is 2 DEI, 2 DEI. We have a couple more questions, but what I'd like to do, Rob and Carlotta, is make sure I give you the opportunity to kind of, leave any nuggets that you think are, important. So, if you're looking at our conversation today and you're looking at what that final, piece of advice is that you might want to share with those that are here. I know we talked about mentorships already, but if there are other things that you'd like for those attending with us today to walk away with, I want to give you an opportunity here to just kind of share that. So, Rob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. In our prep time, Hope, you asked a question, or at least it was made important to you made clear it was important to you. What do compliance officers, this is a compliance conference, right? So what do other compliance professionals need to do to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I would say that particularly for persons of color who are in this industry, in this particular career path, We need to be visible and vocal, both in our boardrooms and in our communities. You know, sometimes, people of color think that we should just put our heads down, just do our work, stay out of trouble, and we'll continue to be successful in our career path. But now is not the time to hide our head in the sands like an ostrich. We need to be center stage, like on this panel. I'd like to see next year's panel have more diversity on it, right? And then we need to collaborate with other professionals, right? Sharing best practices and experiences, again, to help sharpen each other's skill set. The more high-performing people of color in the compliance role, the more respect we'll garner, and then the more we'll be able to attract others to the career path. And then finally, engaged and actively recruiting, at least purposefully exposing other people to a career path in financial services and hopefully compliance as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Carlotta.
So I think I inadvertently hit all of my key talking points.
Okay.
But let me just say this. One, don't let this be the last conversation you have about this. This is why I want to keep emphasizing personal accountability in all of this, because we each have the power to make a difference. And when you focus solely on what your firm is doing and not what you're doing, you can get very complacent.
Yes.
And
yes.
So I want to say, I know I've seen our questions blowing up. So I know there are lots of questions that we did not get to. I personally am always happy to have these conversations. I'm always happy to be a resource. So if any of you who have questions or feel like you're struggling to figure out the next step, want to reach out to me separately, I'm always happy to give guidance, have conversations, talk through these issues. But for yourself, make your own list. What is it you want to achieve? How are you going to achieve it? And when are you going to achieve it? And regardless of what your firm does or what your community does, you will feel better for contributing to this. Because as we said, this isn't going away, and it takes all of us to make the difference.
Oh my goodness. That was the
That's
drop
great.
mic moment there. That was great.
Yes. We unfortunately did not have the opportunity to get to all the questions, and we could actually have this conversation for over a 2-hour period. I thank you all for your time today. And Rob, you mentioned this earlier. Thank you to IAA. For making the space to have this conversation. These are the conversations that will continue to drive our industry's efforts to advancing the expertise of all of us that have dedicated our careers to this industry, and we all want to benefit from the long-term success of our practice area. So with that, I want to pause here and just provide another reminder that the second code, continuing education code, is 2DEI. And that concludes our conversation for today. I really enjoyed speaking with you, Rob and Carlotta. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And the sharing of your best practices, and just the transparency and the honesty around the conversation. I really appreciate it.